about 5 years ago, and what you have in front of you is some T2 viruses attacking an E. coli bacteria. That bacteria is a one-cell creature, and if the virus is successful in injecting its DNA into the bacteria reproduces the virus, and in the worst possible case ends to a thing called lyssage, where a couple of hundred of these critters come out and the bacteria is totally destroyed. And the article, what led me to it was an article I came across in Scientific American about 5 years ago that intrigued me. It was Professor George Church at Harvard was figuring out ways to render a bacteria invulnerable to this kind of attack. And Lester and I gave a talk about 5 years ago on a Monday morning, and it seemed like success was just months away from this project, but actually it turned out that there was not a successful outcome till March of this year, and it'll be in the final series, in the final seminar that I'll talk about, how we finally figured out how to do that job of rendering the E. coli invulnerable.
Wow.
So this is just a rough outline of what we're going to be talking about. So today we'll do just some introductory material, and as I've told everyone, relax. I know most of you are not going on to med school, so there's not going to be any exams in this course at all. So we'll proceed. The first two lectures are a bit soft, and the third and fourth are probably the hardest, and then we'll get into multicellular life. We'll talk a bit about the human genome and human cells, and just recent research that is absolutely fascinating. It's unbelievable just where this field has come. I'll be reporting at the end of a group that has figured out how to make eggs out of the tail of male mice, so that two males can generate offspring. Now, I don't think that's of any concern to anybody right now, but it will be sometime in the future.
Yeah, what pronouns are they going to use?
So the cell it's a wonderful thing. It's the fundamental unit of life. Every living thing on Earth is made up of cells, all the way from that single cell bacteria, the E. coli I showed you on the cover, to our cells and the giant redwoods. There's a great deal of similarity at the cellular level in all these otherwise very different organisms, presumably because living things on Earth sprung from some common ancestor. And we'll be examining that similarity in some detail over the coming weeks. Cells carry out their various functions using physics and chemistry, directed by a set of instructions encoded in a large internal complex molecule, often referred to as DNA. Using those instructions, a cell creates other large complex molecules, mostly proteins, that both sustain the cell and allow it to carry out its preordained functions. The DNA also encodes the blueprint for the creation of the next generation. Now, why the name cell? Well, it turns out that the first person to see a cell, as it was Robert Hooke, quite a long time ago. using a microscope that he built himself, he gazed on a very thin slice of cork, and as he was very accomplished at drawing, presented the illustration on the right that you see in this figure over here, showing the cell-like structure in a book which he called Micrographia. The structures that he observed, and you can see them yourselves, look like simple small cubicles, and they recall to him the sort of things that monks inhabited, and hence that name, the cell. Now, biology dealt with life at a cellular level until about 1940, when investigations at a subcellular level began. With the discovery of the structure and function of DNA by Crick and Watson, in the 50s and 60s, subcellular biology took off. You'll notice misspellings and things in what I write, but it's the way I am. This area is now called molecular biology, and it's mostly what we'll be exploring over the course of these coming weeks. I'm a physicist, and I've spent most of my life as a researcher dealing with the basic constituents of the physical world. So I find biology just incredibly complicated. At the most basic level, biology has to conform with the laws of physics and chemistry. But the properties that emerge from living things are, to say, at the very least, surprising. The level of organization found in the simplest living creatures results from things that, even knowing that we're there, knowing what the answer is, we're unable to explain how that particular answer came about. In a book that Erwin Schrödinger wrote in 1940 called What is Life, he pointed out just how important it is to be involved in very large numbers. They have the power of providing certainty to you where that in their statistical significance, just because the numbers are large, that they can provide certainty to you where you would only have seen impossibility. Here's an example that he gives, which I thought was really nice. Assume you take a cup of water out of the ocean, and you tag every water molecule in that cup, and take it, pour it back into the ocean, stir things up, wait a year so that things really mix, and then go back and take a cup of water anywhere out of the ocean, and what is the likelihood of your finding one of the molecules that you tagged? Well, actually, if the things are completely mixed, you actually will be able to retrieve 1,333 plus or minus 37 of those molecules. And what you didn't realize were there were just that 1,000 times more molecules in the cup of water than there are cups of water in the ocean. And those kind of insights are not the kind of things that are immediately evident to us. So it's this idea of large numbers, small sizes, and short times that are going to continually be coming up in the course of what we're talking about, and things that seemed impossible to you actually have to happen. So you, as well, maybe elderly but otherwise average human beings, you're made up of about 40 trillion cells. I write that number out for you because some people have trouble once things get over 1,000 in realizing how big they are. That's 40 trillion's a lot of cells. And many of them have to carry out very different functions. I think there are basically only something like 200 different kinds of cells in your body. Most of those cells, by the way, are blood cells. The basic structure, though, of cells appears similar, even though they carry out very different functions. I'm afraid I just can't help being a physicist. I'm always looking for similarities that allow me to generalize and simplify things so that they're easy for me to understand. I really liked something that Frank Wilczek, a professor and physicist at MIT, said physicists are really good in telling you what's conceivable and what's positive and what's possible. But if you want to know what is, you have to ask a biologist. Now you might, and I'm always wanting to try to reduce things to the simplest possible terms, but there are just properties that are termed emergent properties, and they're exhibited by systems that are made up of a lot of parts that evidence some totally unexpected behavior based on the properties of their parts. About the smallest living thing we know of is a bacteria known as Mycoplasma genitalium, and it's made up of 300 million atoms. That's the smallest living thing that we can come up with. It needs that many atoms. And you know, as we were talking earlier, when we were in high school, these simple pictures of a cell, kind of a circular thing with something in the middle and something on the outside, not much of anything, to think that it required a minimum of 300 million atoms to compose it was startling. But once you find out what a cell has to do, you come to realize that that's what the task requires. And it shows that life is, to my mind, the supreme emergent phenomena. There's no way you could have seen that a bunch of atoms could have come together and made this thing that we now call life. And life is a particular arrangement of atoms that can recreate themselves by gathering from their environment the matter and energy necessary to accomplish the complex feat of living. As I've said earlier, not only could it have not been foreseen, but even knowing that it occurred still leaves the origin of life as an outcome we're unable to explain with our current state of knowledge. Much has been learned about the structure and function of cells, but the path to the emergence of life is still beyond our grasp. The magic word is evolution. So few of you are scientists, so we're going to have to start with some very basic ideas that underlie the makeup of a cell. All normal matter, that's anything that we can interact with, is made up of electrons, protons, and neutrons. Typically, as you experience them in bulk matter, their minute size and structure, obviously, is not revealed to you. And that, for the most part, was really not well uncovered until the 20th century. Now, these neutrons, protons, and electrons are bound up together in things called atoms. Atoms are electrically neutral objects with a number of light, negatively charged electrons running around a nucleus that is positively charged, containing protons and sometimes a certain number of neutrons to make that nucleus in the center stable. The lightest two nuclei, and the most abundant ones in the universe, hydrogen and helium, were generated just as we emerged from the Big Bang. And somewhat later in the development of the universe, hydrogen and helium, under the forces of gravity, come together, form stars, and that's where all the rest of the chemical elements are born. So, and these atomic nuclei now we treat pretty much in biology as permanent and unchanging entities whose interaction with one another is due to the way their electrons choose to rearrange themselves and find states of lower energy. The universe is now cooled down to the point that in empty space, the temperature is only 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. Fortunately, our planet was formed about 4.5 billion years ago from the debris of previous stars. The temperature warmed by the sun is 286 degrees above absolute zero, or as you know it somewhat better, 57 degrees Fahrenheit. The only life that we currently know of, for sure, exists on Earth, but many, if not most, scientists believe that life exists elsewhere. The figure on the right shows the composition of the chemical elements on the surface of the Earth. And the figure below it, the combination as found inside the living creatures on Earth. And what's immediately striking is carbon, which isn't even evident on this thing on the Earth's crust, makes up an appreciable part of living creatures. And that's because most of the carbon that is on the Earth has somehow sunk into its interior. It tends to merge well with iron, and the density of iron sort of dragged it into the Earth. Carbon has 6 electrons. 2 are inert in its inner shell, and the remaining 4 are in the next shell and allow for many different ways for carbon to bond things. These possibilities are exploited in living creatures. So here I'm trying to give you a really cheap minute-and-a-half chemistry course. At the normally occurring temperatures on Earth, as I said, the atomic nuclei can be regarded as permanent, and all the activity is due to the electrons reconfiguring their orbits to achieve lower energy. So, as a consequence, electromagnetism and quantum mechanics find certain arrangements of the electrons to be energetically favorable and lead to things, for example, the most favorable are configurations occur in what's called the noble gases, helium, neon, and argon, for example. There's a couple more. But the arrangement of their atoms is so favorable that they don't combine with anything else. There's no way to get anything more stable, so they just are chemically inert. On the other hand, hydrogen readily bonds with itself and with carbon to give you CH4 and methane, and, for example, with oxygen, hydrogen bonds to form water. The fact that carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen are missing 4, 3, and 2 electrons from completing that second outer shell of 8. So if you come on over here and look at this diagram, the red things are the electrons that are chemically active, and the gray ones are chemically inactive. So in carbon, as we said, there are the 4 electrons outside, chemically active. Nitrogen has 5, 6 in oxygen, and here's neon, completely stable. Then you go over, whoops, to sodium. So things are wanting to get together to try to make groups of 8. So that's why you have H2O. The oxygen shares 2 electrons with hydrogen, and allowing it to sort of form a group of 8, as with carbon being short 4 electrons, likes to group with 4 hydrogens and borrow their electrons. And so that tendency to try to complete these magic numbers of 2, 8, and 28 lead to chemical reactions that these things, particularly carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen, take a great deal of advantage of, and are able to bond in a variety of ways, and are going to end up being able to make the most unimaginably large and complicated atoms. Many of them we know as proteins. So this is just an example of one hydrogen atom combining with another hydrogen atom, the 2 of them coming together to make that magic number 2. So one will have spin up, the other will have spin down, and obviously it's something we don't need to go into in great detail, but if you were going to really be a researcher in this field of molecular biology, you would have to know this chemistry really cold. Now, another form of atomic interaction that's really essential to life is called hydrogen bonding. It's not real bonding in the sense that the electrons are shared, but, for example, if you just took a whole bunch of H2O molecules, you would have no idea what the devil this stuff would ever be, but you put a whole lot of them together, and the next thing you know, you've got a thing called water. And the reason that you have water is that when oxygen, and bonds with these hydrogen atoms, it ends up being kind of positively charged down on one end, where the 2 hydrogen atoms were, and up on the other end, because it's overall electrically neutral, if it's kind of positive down on this end, it has to be negative up on that end. So the fact that positive and negative charges attract one another makes for a rather weak interaction between water molecules that happens without their bonding, but the positive end, the positive end of the water molecule is attracted towards the negative end of another water molecule. And so between the temperatures 0 degrees and 100 degrees, you get this thing called water. Make it colder than 0 degrees, those bonds are now strong enough that they can hold the thing together, and you get ice. Raise the temperature above 100 degrees, and the atoms have enough energy that they escape, and you have steam. So this property of being a liquid, you can see, is obviously really important to life. You just give yourself a squeeze and see how important it is that you have the properties of being more or less liquid. That is, the molecules that make you up can slide around one inside the around the other, and that accounts for motion. And the other wonderful thing about water is it becomes a medium for chemical interactions to take place. So I think, I guess there's just one thing that I should obviously mention. About 70% of our cells can be looked upon as water. So that's why we more or less float. Some of us a little more than others, maybe others a little denser. Here I'm just showing some of the pictures of a chemical element. For example, I have this thing here. I don't know what its name is, but notice the way the bonding goes. Here's carbon. It needs 4 bonds. It's picked up 2 from that oxygen, 1 from a hydrogen-oxygen comparison, and the 4th from carbon. So you'll always find, if you're careful, that mostly, for example, nitrogen is shy 3 electrons, and so here's got an exchange with carbon and ties into 2 hydrogens. Typically, what you will find in these diagrams of these organic chemicals, molecules, is that carbon is left out. They just assume that you'll have carbon in a spot where there's nothing noted. So this is what you would typically see if you look at it in the literature. Now, what's implied when we say that something? Did I go back here? Yeah. Questions? Al?
I'm a little bit bothered by that simple organism with 300 million atoms. You got those not one by one, but bunches that probably had a million or so water and a million or so carbon and so on. So putting it together is not one by one, which is a little more complex than it sounds.
You bet. But somewhere they existed as individual atoms.
Well, sure.
I mean, that's how they were made. They were not made as chemicals. So somehow that aggregation had to begin somewhere, somehow. And I think it's totally fair to use that as the counting base.
No, I disagree because, yeah, you got to make atoms, but you know, when you're picking them up for an organism, you do it in bulk, not just one by one.
Oh, that's certainly true. But how about the first organism?
Well, it's got more than one atom, that's for darn sure.
Yeah, you bet. And not eventually, primordially, you were dealt single atoms.
Yeah.
Is there a jury here? Any other questions? Okay. So, what do we imply when we say that something is alive? So various biology references seem insistent on at least 5 things. It has a cellular structure that I think comes from just what biologists have observed here on Earth. That's how things are made, how the living things on Earth are made. The configuration has to be stable. That is, it can't be continually changing. It involves the ability to reproduce itself. It shows metabolism. That is, it can take in energy and matter from the environment and grow and reproduce itself. There is a genome that is a thing that encodes the makeup of the creature in its DNA, and so I wrote there DNA and heredity. I think that's a good a list addressing life on Earth, but more generally. So there's an issue of organization. All living things are organized and structured at the molecular, cellular, tissue, organ, whatever level, depending on what they are. There's a maintenance and a metabolism in the fact that the thing can basically keep itself together and use energy from the environment to maintain itself as a consistent maintain itself basically is the same. Living things grow, and as that growth decreases entropy, the amount, and we know that the entropy of the universe has to increase. Life requires an input of energy and by the same token, in order to make the entropy increase, ejecting waste of some kind or other. It responds to external stimuli, and life has to be capable of reproducing itself at the subcellular and cellular level. In some instances, the genetic information is slightly altered. And one thing to me that I couldn't help but notice is that a universal living characteristic of a living thing is that it's temporal. All living things are born, live, and die, and often producing offspring identical or similar to themselves. What was, to me, really surprising, and I encountered it a long time ago by accident, was some work by Johnny von Neumann, a physicist and mathematician, who in 1940 started thinking about the issue of how could I build a robot that would be able to replicate itself. And the idea that he came up with was the following. Somehow the robot would have to carry a complete blueprint for its own construction and maintenance. The robot must have a capability to read the blueprint's instructions, obviously. It must also be capable of executing the blueprint's instruction. And surprisingly enough, a thing you might not have thought of, but turns out to be really important, is the robot must be capable of copying that blueprint and passing the copy onto the new robot. And here I've shown you, here's what von Neumann was doing. Of course, it would be pretty nice if the robot had right with him all the parts that he needed to construct the other robot. Otherwise, he'd have to have some princess to know how to go out and convert sand into silicon and so on and so forth. So it'd be a pretty extensive blueprint in that case. But it turns out that that list that von Neumann came up with is those requirements are found in every biological cell, and maybe the minimum requirements for any object required to reproduce itself. And it's useful to think on these requirements when to understand why a cell is so darn complicated and what its function has to be. So I think that gets me through the introduction. And next week we'll start our investigation by looking at single-cell creatures, typically bacteria. And we'll find them to have most of the characteristics that you need for a cell. At an atomic level, living cells are made of the same atoms found in the inanimate world. These cells are made of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, potassium, and traces of other elements, iron, zinc, and fluorine. The interactions of these atoms are governed by the laws of electromagnetism and quantum mechanics. And somehow, life emerged from 4 billion years ago, when large numbers of these atoms came together under persistent, advantageous circumstances, and life began. Questions? Yes?
Yeah, we have a microphone?
There's a microphone.
I'll repeat the question.
Okay, well, it's not so much a question, it is, I think the one thing that I don't see in these last slides is evolution. If you're going to have life develop, it needs some way of modifying itself incrementally and evolving. So from simplistic to more complex.
Yes. Well, that will get, I mean, that's, how do I want to say that? The fact that we're dealing,
Repeat what she said.
Oh, excuse me. Let me see here.
That's working.
That's where we just say it.
She wanted to know basically about allowing for change and evolution. How does that come about? Well, actually, I didn't, that's at some level, to my mind, complicated. There are thermal fluctuations, so this system of copying itself isn't perfect. Small changes occur in single-celled creatures that don't depend on sexual reproduction, where there you have the opportunity to mix the genes of the two parents and evolving in that direction. But just naturally, changes would be taking place just due to thermal fluctuations. Is that what?
No, I was just bringing out the fact that we need some explanation of evolution. Otherwise, life is temporal. I mean, if life doesn't change, it's going to die out because the circumstances will change, and a lot of life won't be able to adapt to new circumstances.
Right.
Yeah, and so you need some way of adapting to changing circumstances in order for life to survive.
Well, you don't adapt. You simply undergo transformations.
Right.
Some of them are successful, some are not.
But that facilitates adaptation in the large, not as an individual, yeah, you don't adapt. You either live or die, you know.
Yes.
Yeah. But as a group, you can adapt to change.
Well, that's the beauty of large numbers.
Right. Lots of experiments.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, is much of this, the things that appear so mysterious to us are just rather natural consequences of large numbers.
Yep.
Yes?
Isn't it a little strange that when we're talking about chemicals, they are combining for a least energy state
Yes.
constantly, and suddenly some combinations don't bother to find least energy states any longer and start finding high energy states as living matter?
Ah. You mean like ourselves?
Yeah.
Well, we're taking in energy. Energy is being conserved.
Yes.
So in our case, very often, we're taking in energy in the form of food and using it to, we'll find out later, generate triphosphates in our cells. And those triphosphates allow you to overcome certain chemical barriers and go to higher energy states, but at the cost of consuming energy. So life, in a sense, runs contrary
Yes.
to that. Yes. Is that the
Yeah,
point?
that's what.
That was the point you were making.
Well, I'm just trying to absorb the idea.
Uh-huh. Did I help?
Yeah.
Gerry,
Lester.
I didn't hear what Suzanne was saying.
Ah.
I had no idea what she said.
Oh,
Could
okay.
you repeat it, because it sounded as though there was some response, a greater response could be given to her question, but I'm not sure what her question was.
Her question really was trying to account for evolution and adaptation, if you like.
Well, in classic Darwinian terms, we have errors being made, as we would say it now, and Darwin didn't say it this way, errors are being made in the replication
Right.
of DNA.
That's right.
And so new genes are produced.
Yes.
And most of them are failures.
Yeah.
Things crash. But some of them produce a new protein or whatever that gives them a selective advantage. They can be stronger, or they can take advantage of certain nutrients or whatever. And then
I
as a
understand.
result, you know, it's trial and error and selection. Well, those mutations, that's what we call DNA changes, can be advantageous. And that's what leads to evolution.
I just wanted to make sure that it was included with what Gerry presented, that, because he was talking about the things that go with life, and I think evolution, some mechanism that supports evolution is important for life, at least life as we know it.
Well, I mean, so evolution is change. I mean, it's really bad to try to maybe attach too much to evolution. All it is just randomness.
I agree.
Oh, okay.
But if you replicate perfectly every time,
Oh, you bet, you'd be in
you're not going to have
trouble.
evolution.
Yeah, you'd be in
So you
trouble.
have to say, you know, replication is hard, but not always perfect.
Yeah.
It's the imperfections that allow change or adaptation.
Exactly. Let's go back there, Lowell.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can clearly understand what Suzanne said, but adaptation occurs at the individual level. You know, we adapt to our environment. what's passed on to the next generation is not the result of our adaptation, but one of the things that makes
Yes.
it useful or allows us to live in a variety of environments is the fact that we adapt to our environment through behaviors. So I'm not sure exactly where she was going by saying we don't adapt. Species change over time, as Lester pointed out, through the process of natural selection that acts on variability in the gene pool.
Right, but variability is caused by imperfect copying.
Sure. Well, I understand that.
Yeah, I just want to make sure it was included in the overall definition.
We got two issues of adaptation here. One is sort of at the molecular level, and the other is a behavioral level of a very complex organism.
Yes. Agreed.
You're saying that mutations are caused mainly by thermal fluctuations?
Well, I mean, that's one way to look at it.
I don't know, is it more caused by thermal fluctations rather than cosmic rays or some other accident?
Cosmic rays make a particular kind of problem. They may break double bond. They make a double bond break in DNA. It's not clear.
Most imperfections in reproduction don't come from that.
Yeah.
They come from thermal fluctuations.
I believe so.
I see. I don't know. Thanks.
There is some there.
I was just going to ask you, what Susan was asking was that you add to the list of things that constitute the necessities of life,
Yes.
the ability to evolve, or the possibility of evolve. Is that what you're asking?
Well, it's important to life as we understand it, yes.
Yeah.
The robot example, if you always
There's
reproduce
the
a
list
perfect
up there.
robot, then you would not evolve.
Right. Right. So that list up there,
Is that the list you wanted? Or was it this one?
That one, yeah, that one.
That one doesn't say, it could be either one, but. The second one, the robot one, does not imply that there's imperfections in the copying. In fact, the implication is that it's a perfect copy.
You bet. You bet. Now, I think he hadn't thought enough about adaptation to include it. Okay. Al.
Well, this isn't really a question, but sort of a smart-ass comment. I worried about those cells from the mouse tail
Yes.
being able to create an organism. What kind of pronoun would they use?
I think it's quite clear. It's a he.
Well,
He's plural.
Okay.
We're in the quantum. Let's leave.
See you next week.